The auctioneer's gavel never came down on me, but on a cold Tuesday in November, my husband of 48 years did something worse. He sold me, not for money, for a woman half my age and a future he had already built without me. The woman who walked out of that lawyer's office with $847 and 2 cardboard suitcases, that woman wasn't me. Not yet. I didn't know it then, but I was about to meet her in a cabin my dead mother had been waiting for me to find for 33 years. My name is Mirabelle Ashford. Most people call me Mira. I am 75 years old. I have a college degree in literature from the University of Wisconsin. I never used it because in 1971, when I was 22, a tall man named Warren Ashford told me he wanted a wife who made a home, not one who chased careers. I said yes. I said yes for 48 years. I said yes when he wanted 3 meals on the table at 6 o'clock sharp. I said yes when he told me my hair looked old at his firm's Christmas party. I said yes when our son Gideon moved to Seattle and stopped calling. I said yes when our daughter Cecilia grew distant in Chicago. I said yes until the night Warren came home from work on the eve of our 48th anniversary and slid a manila envelope across the kitchen table where my pot roast was still steaming. He didn't sit down. He didn't take off his coat. He stood at the counter in his charcoal suit and his polished shoes, and he said her name, Natasha Crane, 35 years old, a business partner he had been quietly grooming for 2 years. He said he had fallen in love with her. He said she understood him in ways I never had. He said he would need me to be out of the house by the end of November. He said it like a man reading a contract, like he had practiced it in the car. Like I was an inconvenience he had finally found the courage to file away. I don't remember the first hour after that. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with the pot roast still in front of me, the gravy congealing in its little white boat, the sound of Warren upstairs in our bedroom packing my things. I remember thinking that's the second drawer down the one where I keep my mother's pearls. I remember thinking he doesn't know I keep my mother's letters in the back of my closet. I remember thinking this is the kitchen where I taught my children to crack eggs. I remember thinking this floor will not feel my feet again. The next morning I called my lawyer, or rather the only lawyer I had ever known. The one who had drawn up Warren's will. The one whose Christmas card had arrived faithfully every December for 30 years addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Ashford. He cleared his throat when he heard my voice. He told me gently the way a man tells a stranger that her dog has died that the house was no longer in our names. Warren had moved it into the holdings of his real estate company 3 years ago. A tax strategy he had told me at the time, sliding papers in front of me at the same kitchen table. Just sign here, sweetheart. It's nothing. I had signed. I had not read. I had trusted. I had signed away my home. That was the first earthquake. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after he hung up. The kitchen smelled of old gravy and a marriage that had been alive for longer than I could measure. I called my son. Gideon is 46. He built something with computers in Seattle that I have never understood. He sighed when he heard my voice the way he had been sighing since he was 16. He said, "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Dad is being generous. He doesn't have to give you anything." I told him about the house, about Natasha, about the manila envelope. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said something I will remember on the day I die. He said, "Mom, I've known for over a year. We all have. We were just hoping you'd figure it out before someone had to tell you." I called my daughter. Cecilia is 43. She fixes teeth in Chicago. She has a husband named Jeffrey who has never looked me in the eye. She didn't sigh. She was colder than that. She said, "I'm not picking a side, Mother. You'll land on your feet. You always do." And then she said she had a patient waiting, and she hung up. They were both wrong about that. I had never landed on my feet. I had simply stood where I was placed for 48 years. I took 2 suitcases. I took my mother's pearls. I took a cardboard box of my mother's books, the ones she had brought from Sweden when she came to America in 1948, with my grandmother in a single trunk. I took the small velvet pouch from the back of my jewelry drawer, the one that held the brass key my mother had pressed into my hand 33 years ago on the day she died of a stroke in a hospital bed in Duluth, with my hand wrapped around hers, and her last words in Swedish that I had been too tired to understand. "Min lilla flicka. Willow Creek will be there if you ever need somewhere to go." I had laughed at her gently then. I had kissed her forehead. I had told her I didn't need anywhere to go. I had a beautiful home. I had a husband. I had 2 children. I had everything a woman could want. I had not understood. I understood now. The cabin was called Willow Creek. It sat on 40 acres of pine and birch on the eastern shore of Silver Lake in the north woods of Wisconsin. A 4-hour drive from Milwaukee, on roads that grew narrower and stranger the farther north you went. My grandmother Astrid had bought the land in 1952. My mother Eleanor had inherited it in 1989. She had given the key to me in 1991. I had only been there once. The summer I was 7 years old, my grandmother brought me up to meet the cabin she had bought for the women in our family. I remembered almost nothing of that visit, except the lantern light on the birches at dawn, and my mother sitting alone on the dock, looking at the water as if she were trying to memorize it. I had never gone back. Warren had laughed about it at dinner parties for years. Mira's tiny inheritance, a cabin so far north it might as well be in Canada. 40 acres of mosquitoes and regret. I had laughed with him. I had been ashamed of it. I had let him make it small. Now it was all I had. I drove my old Buick station wagon, the one Warren had told me I could keep, because he didn't want it north on Interstate 94 through a cold November rain. The wipers smeared the windshield. The heater worked only on one side. I drove for 4 hours. I cried for 3 of them. The kind of crying a woman does when she has finally truly run out of road. The sky got lower. The trees got taller. The towns got smaller until they were just clusters of houses around a feed store and a church and a single flashing yellow light. I passed Birchwood Falls just after 4 in the afternoon. The sun was already dying. The dirt road to Willow Creek was barely a road anymore. Weeds had grown waist-high down the center. Fallen branches lay across it like broken ribs. My old wagon scraped against the undergrowth. For a long, terrible moment, I thought the engine would give out and leave me stranded 5 miles from the nearest human being. It didn't. It kept going, which somehow felt worse. The cabin appeared through the pines, suddenly the way cabins do in the northern woods. There was no clearing announcing it, no sign, no welcome. One moment there were only trees, and the next there was Willow Creek. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was enormous. It pressed against the windows. It pressed against my chest. I sat with both hands on the steering wheel, and I looked at what my mother had left me on the day she died. The cabin was smaller than I remembered. Much smaller. A single-story log structure, maybe 400 square feet. A sagging porch. A rusted metal roof stained with pine sap and decades of fallen needles. One front window cracked. The chimney stones come loose on one side. Moss had crept up the north wall until the wall and the forest floor were almost the same thing. Behind the cabin, through a gap in the pines, I could see Silver Lake, gray and still and wide under the cold November sky, with the first thin skin of ice already forming along the shallows. This was where 48 years of marriage had brought me. I opened the car door. The cold hit me like a slap. A dry mineral cold that smelled of pine resin and lake water and something older than both. I limped toward the cabin, my hip already protesting. I climbed the 3 sagging porch steps. The brass key fit the lock perfectly. The door swung open with a low groan. Inside it was worse than I had prepared for. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood smoke and the unmistakable scent of mice. A single room. A cast-iron stove rusted at the seams. A narrow bed frame with a mattress so old it had collapsed on itself. A small table, 2 wooden chairs, one of them broken. A cupboard with its door hanging off one hinge. A sink with a hand pump that clearly hadn't moved in years. No electricity, no running water, no heat. Nothing. I stood in the doorway and something inside me gave way. I was 75 years old. I had $847 in a checking account Warren hadn't managed to touch. I had 2 suitcases in the back of my car. I had a box of my mother's books. I had a coat that wasn't warm enough for what was coming. I had nowhere else on earth to go. I sat down slowly on the broken chair, the one that still mostly worked, and I began to cry. Not gently. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a woman who was managing. I cried the way a woman cries when 48 years of silence finally crack open inside her chest. Outside on the lake, a single loon called once across the water. A long, low, mournful note. It sounded exactly like what I felt inside. And then it was quiet again, and I sat alone in my mother's cabin as the November light began to fail, wondering if this was where I had come to die. I woke the next morning with my coat still buttoned to my throat, my breath fogging the cold air above my face. For one confused moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the smell of old wood smoke and mice reached me, and I remembered. I was alive, somehow. That was the first surprise. The second surprise came 20 minutes later. There was a knock at the door. I had been a married woman in a quiet suburb for 48 years. I had answered 1,000 doors. But when that knock came at Willow Creek that morning, my hands began to shake because I could not imagine who in the world knew I was here. I opened the door 3 inches. A man stood on the porch. He was about my age, perhaps a few years younger. Weathered the way men get weathered when they have spent a lifetime outdoors. He wore a canvas barn coat and a wool cap. He had a thermos in one hand and a paper bag in the other. Behind him, a battered green pickup truck idled in the dirt drive. "Ma'am," he said and tipped his cap. "My name is Samuel Brennan. I farm the 80 acres south of here. I saw your headlights come up the road last night, and I figured whoever was in the cabin probably hadn't had a hot breakfast. May I come in?" I did not know what to say, so I stepped back and let him in. Samuel Brennan looked around my mother's cabin the way a man looks at a place he has loved. He set the thermos on the table. He set the paper bag down beside it. He pulled biscuits and a jar of elderberry jam out of the bag. He poured coffee into a tin mug from the thermos. He pushed it toward me. He pulled out the broken chair and sat in it. And the chair, which had nearly given way under my weight, held him without a creak. "You're Eleanor's girl, aren't you?" he said. It was not a question. I nodded. "Mira." "Yes. Your mother saved my wife's life." He looked down at his big, weathered hands on the table. Grace had cancer, the kind they didn't have a lot of treatment for back then. Your mother taught her how to make a tea from yarrow and red clover, and 3 other things I can't pronounce. Grace drank that tea every morning for 2 years. Doctors didn't know what to do with her when she went into remission. We knew. I stared at him. "My mother was a housewife," I said. Samuel Brennan looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled. A slow, gentle smile. The way a man smiles when he is about to tell a child something kind. "Mira," he said, "your mother was a housewife in Duluth. Up here, she was something else." I sat down in the other chair. The coffee was hot. The biscuits were warm. I had not eaten anything but crackers in 24 hours. "What do you mean?" "She came up here every summer," Samuel said. "Sometimes for a week, sometimes for a month. Your father didn't come with her. She told us he didn't like the woods. She came alone. She stayed in this cabin. She walked these woods. She fished off her dock. She helped Grace. And she helped half the women in Birchwood Falls. She was the closest thing this town had to a doctor for 30 years. 30 years. Mira, your mother died in 1991. She had been coming up here every summer since 1962. I set the mug down. My hand was shaking too much to hold it. I didn't know. "No, ma'am." I figured. He stayed for an hour. He told me which logs in the south wall were rotten and which were still good. He told me where the well was and how to prime the pump if it stuck. He told me the woodshed behind the cabin still had a half cord of dry oak that my mother had stacked there in the summer of 1991, the year before she died. He told me his wife Grace would come over in a week or two to bring me a casserole and to see how I was holding up. He told me he was sorry for whatever had brought me here. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. A woman 75 years old alone in November in a cabin with no heat was a story that wrote itself. When he left, I stood on the porch and I watched his green truck disappear back down the dirt road. My mother had been coming here for 30 years. My mother had been a healer. My mother had had a life I had never seen. I went back inside. I sat on the broken chair and I tried to understand what kind of woman my mother had been. I realized with a slow, cold certainty that settled into my chest, like ice forming on a lake, that I had no idea. I had loved a stranger for 41 years before she died, and she had loved me enough to keep her real life hidden so that my father would never take it from her, and so that I would still have a mother to come home to. I spent the next 10 days surviving. That was all. I didn't plan, I didn't dream. I just moved from one small task to the next and prayed my body would hold. I dragged the ruined mattress outside. I swept the cabin with a birch broom I found behind the stove. I scrubbed mouse droppings off the cupboard shelves with rags torn from an old flannel shirt I found folded on a high shelf. A shirt that still faintly smelled of my mother's lavender soap. I pressed it to my face and I stood in the middle of the cabin and I cried for the second time since arriving. Quieter this time. I pumped the kitchen sink until my arm shook. On the fourth day, the handle finally loosened, and cold, clean water came gasping up from the well below the cabin. I almost fell to my knees. I filled a pot. I boiled it on the rusted stove which I had coaxed back to life with dried birch bark and matches, and a stubbornness I didn't know I still owned. I ate carefully. I had brought crackers, canned soup, oatmeal, a jar of peanut butter. I had figured out on day 2 that I would need to make it last at least a month. I spoke to no one. Samuel came once more with firewood. He didn't come inside. He stacked it on the porch, tipped his cap, and drove away. And slowly, something I had not expected began to happen. I began to notice things. I noticed the loons on Silver Lake calling to each other every morning at dawn, and every evening at dusk. Their voices filling the cabin, even through closed windows. I noticed the chickadees who came to the porch railing weren't afraid of me. I noticed that when I sat still on the dock in the late afternoon, the lake turned colors I had no name for. Pewter, then rose, then a soft violet, then black. On the 10th day, I was sweeping under the narrow bed frame when my broom struck something solid beneath the floorboards. I paused. I got down on my aching knees. After a 5-minute operation involving the bed frame and a great deal of breath held against the pain, I ran my hand along the wooden planks. One of them was loose. I pressed on it and it shifted beneath my palm. I worked my fingertips into the seam and slowly, carefully, I lifted the plank away. Beneath it was a small flat wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. My mother's handwriting on the top in faded pencil said, "Only for Mira when you are ready." I did not open the box that day. I sat on the floor beside the lifted plank for a long time, my hands trembling in my lap. I looked at my mother's handwriting, that careful, slanted script I had not seen in 33 years. And I felt something I had not felt since the day Warren slid the manila envelope across the kitchen table. I felt seen. For Mira when you are ready. My mother had written those words at some point before she died. My mother had known. My mother had placed this box beneath this floorboard knowing that one day I would come. Knowing that one day I would need to come. I did not feel ready. Not yet. Whatever was inside that box had waited 33 years. It could wait a little longer. I wrapped the oilcloth back over the top, lowered the plank carefully into place, and sat there on the cold floor with my hand pressed flat to the wood for a long, long time. That night, the first real storm came. It arrived the way northwood storms do without apology. The wind began after dark, a low moaning through the pines that built and built until the whole cabin was shaking. Then came the snow driven sideways in sheets so thick I could not see the lake from my window. The temperature dropped so fast I could hear the cabin's old logs creaking as they contracted. I fed the stove every hour. I wore my coat and my hat and 2 pairs of socks. I wrapped myself in every blanket I owned, and still I shivered. The wind found every gap in the old chinking between the logs. It came through the cracked window. It came up through the floor. At some point in the night, a branch came down on the roof with a crack like a rifle shot. I sat bolt upright on the mattress and waited to see if the ceiling would follow. It didn't, but the wind kept screaming. The storm lasted 2 days. By the second night, I had burned through nearly all the dry wood I had stacked inside. The storm showed no sign of stopping. I was exhausted. I was hungry in a way I had never been hungry in my life. My hip had locked so badly I could barely stand. And somewhere around midnight, as the wind howled and the cabin shook and I lay curled on the mattress with ice forming on the inside of the window, something inside me snapped. I sat up. I threw off the blankets and I stood up in the middle of that freezing cabin, and I screamed. Not words, just sound. A raw, cracked animal sound that came up from somewhere below my ribs. 48 years of silence, finally breaking open. I screamed at the storm. I screamed at Warren. I screamed at Gideon and Cecilia. And every dinner party I had smiled through, and every birthday I had remembered for a man who could not be bothered to remember mine. I screamed at the girl I had been at 22 who had said yes when she should have said, wait. I screamed until my throat was raw, and my legs gave out and I sank down onto the mattress again, shaking. And then in the silence that followed, I heard something, a small rhythmic sound coming from above me, a tapping. I went very still. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, and it was coming from the ceiling, somewhere near the back of the cabin above the cupboard. There was a sound like a loose board knocking against a beam in the draft. I had never heard it before because I had never screamed before. The storm had been masking it. My own grief had been masking it. I limped across the cabin to the cupboard. I looked up. The ceiling of the cabin was low, just timber beams and rough planks. The underside of what I had assumed was the roof. But now I looked more carefully, and I saw what I had missed for 2 weeks. The planks above the cupboard did not quite match the rest of the ceiling. They were slightly newer, slightly smoother. And in one corner, a small iron ring rusted almost to invisibility was set flush into the wood. It wasn't a roof. It was a hatch. I dragged a chair over. I climbed up, both hands gripping the cupboard, my hip shrieking. I reached up and hooked my fingers through the iron ring. I pulled. Nothing. It was stuck. Decades of damp and dust and disuse holding it shut. I pulled again, harder, and something in my shoulder gave a warning pop. But I didn't care. I braced my feet on the chair. I hauled down with every ounce of weight my 75-year-old body had left, and the hatch came loose with a cracking sound and swung down on a groaning hinge. A folded wooden ladder dropped out of the ceiling with it. Cold, still air rushed down. Air that had been sealed above me for a long, long time. And with it came a smell I had not smelled in 33 years. Linseed oil, cedar shavings, lavender. The unmistakable, unforgettable smell of my mother's hands. I stood on the chair in the shaking cabin, with the storm still screaming outside. And I looked up into the darkness of the loft my mother had built and hidden, and left for me. And I understood with a clarity that went through me like lightning, that everything I thought I knew about my mother had been only half the story. I gripped the ladder. I began to climb. The ladder creaked beneath my weight, but it held. I climbed slowly, one painful rung at a time. When my head rose above the level of the hatch, I stopped and simply stared. The loft was not large, maybe 8 feet by 12. The ceiling sloped down sharply on both sides, following the pitch of the roof. A single small window at the gable end, a window I had never noticed from outside because it was half hidden by pine branches, let in the pale storm light. But what was inside that small space stopped my breath. Quilts, dozens of them, stacked on shelves, folded on a long workbench, hanging from beams, quilts in patterns I had never seen with stitching so fine it looked like writing. A wedding ring quilt in shades of blue, a log cabin quilt in deep autumn reds, a storm at sea quilt that seemed to move when I looked at it, each one signed with a small, careful E embroidered in the corner. My mother had been a quilter. My mother had been a quilter her entire life, and I had never known. But that was only the beginning. On the workbench beside a half-finished quilt still pinned to its frame were paintbrushes and small jars of paint and a wooden palette. Above the workbench on a shelf sat 7 leather-bound notebooks. I would learn later that they were filled with her healing recipes. Hundreds of them gathered over 30 years. Yarrow and red clover, willow bark, skullcap. The plants she had walked these woods to find. The remedies she had given to women like Grace Brennan when the doctors in Duluth had nothing to offer. And against the far wall, propped on a small easel, was a painting of a child, a girl of about 7 with 2 brown braids and serious dark eyes, sitting on the dock at Silver Lake at sunrise, looking out at the water. It was me. I had not been to this cabin since I was 7 years old. My mother had painted me from memory sometime in the last 30 years of her life, and she had kept the painting up here where my father would never see it. I pulled myself fully into the loft. I sat down heavily on the wooden floor. I tried to make sense of it. Eleanor Strand, who had spent her life cooking my father's meals and pressing his shirts, and listening to him complain about his back. Eleanor, who had never once in my memory picked up a paintbrush or a needle or a healing herb in our family home in Duluth. Eleanor, who had been married for 51 years to a man named Oswald Strand. My father, who had laughed at his wife when she spoke and cut her off mid-sentence at dinner parties, and who had once, I remembered now with a cold, clear shock, thrown one of her quilts into the fireplace because he said it was a waste of a grown woman's time. She had not made another quilt at home after that. Not ever. Not that I had seen. But she had come here. Somehow across the decades. She had come here to this cabin, to this loft, and she had kept her art alive and secret. She had carried it up that hidden ladder and closed the hatch behind her, and become for whatever hours she could steal the artist she actually was. That was when I saw the envelope. It sat, propped on the workbench against a small embroidered pillow, in a spot that would catch the light of anyone who climbed up into the loft. The paper had yellowed. My mother's handwriting on the front said simply, "For my Mirabelle." I took a long time to reach for it. My hands were shaking when I finally did. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered front and back in my mother's careful Swedish accented English. Min lilla flicka. If you are reading this, then you have finally come. I have hoped and feared this day in equal measure for many years. I know what you are living. I know because I lived it too. I married your father at 21. By 30, I had forgotten who I was. By 40, I had accepted it. By 50, I had decided it was too late. This cabin saved me. My mother's mother left it to my mother, and my mother left it to me. And now I am leaving it to you. It is a woman's cabin. It has always been. The men in our family never wanted it because it is small and far, and seems worthless to them. That is how it has survived. Come here, Min Flicka, open the hatch, use the needles, use the paints, walk the woods and learn the plants. You will not believe what your hands remember. You were always the one with the eyes of an artist, even as a small girl. I watched your father beat that out of you before you were 12 the way mine beat it out of me. I was not strong enough to stop him then. Forgive me. But it is not gone. It is only buried. And you will find it again exactly where I left mine for you. Here at Willow Creek, where the lantern light catches the birches at dawn. You are not too old. You are not finished. You are only now beginning. Mama. I sat in the cold loft, loft, and I read the letter 3 times before I could make the words stop swimming. Then I folded it with slow, careful hands, and I held it against my chest. And I wept. But these were not the tears of 2 weeks ago. These were not the tears of a woman who had run out of road. These were the tears of a woman who had just discovered that the road went much farther than she had thought, and that her mother had walked ahead of her on it all along, leaving markers lighting the way. But there was more in that loft, so much more. Underneath the workbench, in a wooden chest with brass hinges green with age, I found them. Letters. Hundreds of letters. Each one in an envelope. Each one addressed to me at our house in Duluth, where I had lived as a girl. And then at our house in Milwaukee, where I had lived as a wife. Each one stamped. Each one unsealed. Each one undelivered. I picked up the one on top. I opened it. The date was June 14th, 1978. Dear Mira, you are pregnant with Gideon. You called me yesterday and I could hear in your voice that he is already disappointing you. I want to tell you it gets better. I cannot tell you that because it does not. But I can tell you this. The baby will be yours. He cannot take that. Hold on to that. Mama. I picked up another. June 12th, 1986. Dear Mira, you came for Easter and you wore a green dress, and you laughed once in the garden when Cecilia picked a tulip. For 1 second I saw you again, the girl you were. I cried for an hour after you left. Mama. I picked up another. November 3rd, 1991, 6 months before she died. Dear Mira, he will leave you. Maybe not soon. Maybe not for many years. But he will leave you. Because men like him always leave eventually. They take everything they can take and then they leave. I am writing this so that when it happens you will know that I knew and that I prepared. Come to Willow Creek when it happens. The cabin is yours. There is more here than you think. Mama. I sat on the floor of that loft with letters spilling across my lap, and I began to understand the shape of my mother's love. She had watched me disappear into Warren's life year by year, season by season. She had heard it in my voice when I called. She had seen it in my face when I visited. And she had been powerless to stop it because to speak the truth would have meant losing me entirely. My father would have seen to that. Warren would have seen to that. So instead she had written it down. Every thought she could not say. Every warning she could not speak. Every moment of recognition when she saw herself in me. The pattern repeating the cycle, continuing daughter, following mother into the same silent cage. 207 letters, 30 years of documentation, a mother's chronicle of a daughter's slow erasure, and a promise that somewhere, somehow, there would be a place to begin again. I opened another letter. This one from April 1975, 3 years into my marriage. Dear Mira, you told me today that Warren thinks you should lose weight before his company picnic. You laughed when you said it. like it was a joke you were both in on. But I heard something else in your voice. I heard the sound of a woman learning to see herself through the eyes of a man who will never be satisfied. Your father did this to me. I let him. I am watching you let Warren do it to you. And I do not know how to tell you to stop without losing you forever. So I write this instead, and I put it in a box, and I pray that one day you will read it and know that I saw. I always saw. Mama. Another. September 1982. Dear Mira Cecilia called me yesterday. She is 9 years old, and she asked me why you never smile anymore. I told her that grown-ups get tired sometimes. I lied to my granddaughter to protect my daughter's marriage to a man who is killing her slowly. I do not know if I will ever forgive myself for this. Mama. Another. January 1989. Dear Mira, you came for your father's funeral. You stayed 3 days. Warren did not come. He said work was too busy. You made excuses for him. You have been making excuses for him for 16 years. I wanted to shake you. I wanted to scream. Instead, I held your hand at the service and I watched you defend a man who could not be bothered to see his father-in-law buried. And I knew that when I die, you will still be making excuses. And he will still be too busy. Mama. The letters went on and on. A catalog of small cruelties. A record of compromises. A mother watching her daughter become smaller and quieter and more apologetic year after year, and being unable to do anything but bear witness and prepare. Prepare for the day I would finally come here. The day she had always known was coming. I counted them. 207 letters written across 3 decades. Filed in chronological order, waiting in a wooden box beneath a workbench in a loft I had not known existed until 3 hours ago. And then I found the letter that broke me open all over again. It was not written to me. It was written to my mother. The handwriting was unfamiliar. A man's handwriting, careful and slanted. The postmark was Minneapolis. July 1968. Eleanor, I am not going to write to you again after this. You have made your choice, and I will respect it, even if I do not understand it. You told me you cannot leave because of your daughter. You told me Mirabelle needs a mother more than you need a life. I want you to know that I think you are wrong, but I love you enough to let you be wrong. I am leaving for Minneapolis in the morning. The studio space will be there if you ever change your mind. It will always be there. Yours, Leaf. I sat with that letter in my hand for a long time. Leaf. A man named Leif. A studio in Minneapolis. A life my mother could have had. In 1968, I would have been 17 years old, a senior in high school, already dating Warren, already on the path to becoming the woman who would lose herself. She had stayed for me. She had given up a man who saw her, who would have let her paint, who would have called her an artist, because she did not believe a 17-year-old girl could survive losing her mother. And then she had spent the rest of her life writing me letters I would never read, and saving money I would never know about, and praying that one day I would be brave enough to do for myself what she had not been brave enough to do for herself. I pressed the letter to my chest, and I whispered into the cold loft, "I'm sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry. You didn't have to." But of course she had thought she did. That was what mothers of her generation did. That was what mothers of mine did too. We stayed. We disappeared. We told ourselves we were doing it for our children. And our children grew up and disappeared too. And the great chain of disappearing women went on until it didn't. Until one of us finally climbed a ladder in a hidden loft and read the letters and decided that the chain would break here. With me. At the bottom of the chest, there was a small ledger, a bank book. First Northern Bank of Birchwood Falls, Wisconsin. The account was in my name. The first deposit was in 1965, 3 years after she had started coming north when she finally had quilts to sell. The deposits continued small and regular every few months for 30 years. She had been selling her quilts through a dealer in Duluth, I would learn later. Every dollar she made, she had quietly put into an account in my name. The current balance was $47,218. I sat there in the cold loft with the storm howling outside, and I held my mother's bank book in my hands, and I understood that I had been loved my entire life by a woman I had never been allowed to truly know, and that she had loved me enough to prepare for the day my husband would throw me away 30 years before he did it. December came down on Willow Creek like a hammer. The cold was not the cold I had known in Milwaukee all my life. This was something else. A deep, patient northern cold that crept in through the log walls, no matter how much wood I fed the stove. That froze the water in my kettle if I left it too far from the heat. That made my fingers ache so badly at night I could not sleep. But I had work to do. I climbed the ladder every morning before dawn. I lit the small kerosene lamp in the loft. I sat at my mother's workbench and I tried to remember what my hands had once known. I had not held a sewing needle since 1976. I had not picked up a paintbrush since I was a child. It was humiliating. My first attempt at piecing together a quilt block was so crooked that the seams wouldn't lie flat. I tried again. The second one was worse. The third one I threw across the loft, and I cried for an hour because my hands were swollen and stiff and 75 years old, and they did not remember anything. But I climbed the ladder again the next morning and the morning after that, because what else was there? 2 weeks before Christmas, Grace Brennan came to the cabin, Samuel's wife. Grace was 73. A small bird-boned woman with iron gray hair and bright blue eyes that missed nothing. She walked into my cabin with a casserole in one hand and a wooden quilting frame slung over her shoulder like a rifle. "Samuel told me you were up in the loft trying to teach yourself to quilt out of nothing," she said, setting her things on the table. I told him that was the saddest thing I had ever heard. "Your mother taught me to quilt 40 years ago, Mira. Sit down. Let me show you. She sat with me at the workbench in the loft for 4 hours that day. She showed me how to thread a needle so my swollen fingers could feel the eye. She showed me how to mark a quilt block with a piece of soap. She showed me how to use a thimble that had belonged to her grandmother. And as we worked, she told me about my mother. "Your mother used to come to my kitchen every August," Grace said. "She'd bring a basket of yarrow and red clover. We'd sit at my table for 2 days drying it. She'd talk about you the whole time, about what you were doing, about your husband. She knew Mira. She knew that man was not good to you. She'd sit there with her hands full of dried flowers and she'd say, 'Grace, my Mirabelle is disappearing. I can hear it in her voice when she calls. I don't know how to bring her back.' I had to set my needle down. She never said anything to me. No, honey, she couldn't. He read your mail. She told me once if I write what I really think, he'll cut us off completely. I'd rather have a fake daughter than no daughter at all. So she wrote it all down in letters she didn't send. She told me that too. She said one day you'd find them. She said one day you'd come here and the cabin would tell you everything she couldn't." Grace looked at me across the workbench. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Mira," she said, "you are home now." She came back twice a week through December and into January. By the middle of December, I had finished 4 quilt blocks that were almost straight. By Christmas, I had 8. Grace brought me fabric scraps from her own stash. She brought me thread in colors I didn't know existed. She brought me Samuel's old work shirt, soft from years of washing, perfect for backing. And one afternoon in early January, while she helped me pin my first real quilt block to its frame, she said something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. "Quilting," she said, "is just stitching together the scraps of what life cuts away from you. Every quilt is a story of survival. A woman keeps the scraps because she knows she'll need them someday. And then one day she sits down and she sews them together. And what was left over becomes the warmest thing in her house." By the middle of January, I had finished my first real quilt, a small one, just a lap quilt made from squares of fabric I had found in my mother's chest. Pieces of her old dresses. Pieces of my old dresses that she must have kept somehow from when I was a child. A piece of an apron I recognized from her kitchen in 1965. When I held it up in the lantern light of the loft, I understood that my mother had been saving these scraps for me to find. She had wanted me to make this quilt. She had known I would need it. That was the day I fell. I was coming down the ladder with my mother's smallest scissors in my hand, a violation of a rule I had set for myself on day 1. Never carry sharp objects on the ladder. But I was excited. I was proud. I wanted to show Grace my finished quilt when she came that afternoon, and the scissors were in my hand, and I forgot. Halfway down, my hip gave out. My foot slipped. I came down hard on the cabin floor. My right shoulder hit first. The scissors caught me across the inside of my left forearm on the way down. The cut was deep. I lay on the floor of the cabin in the gray January light, and I watched my own blood spread across the wooden planks. For a moment I felt completely calm. And then the pain arrived and I began to shake. I managed to crawl to the sink. I pumped water with my good hand. I wrapped the wound with strips of an old flannel shirt. I tied it as tight as I could with my teeth in one trembling hand. The bleeding slowed but did not stop. I could not drive, not like this, not on those roads, not in this cold, not with this arm. I lay down on the mattress and pulled the blankets over myself and stared at the ceiling. My shoulder throbbed. My arm throbbed. Everything I had was throbbing. And something inside me, the thing that had been holding me up since the letters, since the loft, since the hatch, simply let go. I was 75 years old. I was hurt on the floor of a cabin in the woods. I had no one. Warren would not come. Gideon would not come. Cecilia would not come. I had thought, somewhere underneath everything, that maybe I had been making a new life. But a new life is a fragile thing, and one fall is all it takes to break it. I turned my face to the wall and I thought, I cannot do this. I am too old. Mama was wrong. I lay there for hours. The light shifted across the cabin floor. The stove went out. The cold began to seep back in, and somewhere deep in the afternoon, half delirious, I turned my head and looked up at the open hatch above the cupboard. I had stopped closing it weeks ago, and I saw hanging from a peg just inside the loft the first quilt block I had ever made. The crooked one. The one I had been so ashamed of. I had climbed back up a week later and pinned it there anyway. I didn't remember doing it, but there it was. Crooked. Wrong. Small. And also the only thing I had ever made with my own hands for myself. For no one else in 75 years of living. I looked at that terrible little square of fabric, and I understood something I had been circling for weeks without touching. My worth was not in being seen. My worth was in the making. I sat up slowly. I relit the stove, and I called Samuel on the cell phone I kept by the window for emergencies. He drove me to the urgent care clinic in Birchwood Falls that night. The young doctor put 23 stitches in my forearm. She told me I had been lucky. She told me to come back in 10 days to have the stitches removed. She did not ask how a woman my age had ended up alone in a cabin with an injury like that. I think she could see the answer in my face. Samuel drove me home through the dark. He did not speak much. When we pulled up at Willow Creek, he turned in his seat and looked at me. "Mira," he said, "your mother fell once too. 1986. Broke her ankle. She stayed at our house for 3 weeks. Grace nursed her. Your father didn't know. She told him she was visiting an old friend in Duluth." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. The women in your family have been falling and getting up for a long time. You're not the first one. You won't be the last. And up here you have us. You always have. You just didn't know." I couldn't speak. I just nodded. He squeezed my good hand. He let me go. I healed slowly. The cut on my arm left a long, pale scar from the inside of my elbow, halfway down my wrist. I could not use that hand for 2 weeks. I ate one-handed. I pumped water one-handed. I fed the stove one-handed. I did not climb the ladder until the end of January when I could finally grip a rung without the wound opening. But when I climbed again, I climbed differently. Something had shifted in me after the fall. The scar on my arm was not a mark of failure. It was proof that I had tried, that I had kept going, that my body, even at 75, even broken, even afraid, was capable of healing itself. By the end of February, I had finished 3 more quilts. By early March, I had begun my first painting. Not the lake, not yet. I wasn't ready for the lake. But the view from the cabin window at dawn, when the first light caught the birches and turned their white bark to gold. March came. The days stretched longer. The cold loosened its grip by small, reluctant increments. In early April, the ice broke on Silver Lake. It happened overnight. I woke to a sound I did not recognize. A low, cracking, groaning music coming from the water. I hurried out onto the porch in my coat and stood there in the cold blue dawn and watched the lake come back to life. Great slabs of ice shifted and broke and slid against each other, making a sound like distant thunder. The color of the water beneath was so dark it was almost black. Then it caught the light and turned to pewter, then to something like hammered silver. The loons returned the next morning. I heard their call across the water as the sun rose, and I wept standing barefoot on the dock because it sounded like being welcomed home. By May, I was carrying quilts into Birchwood Falls. The first time I walked into the feed store on Main Street with 3 small lap quilts folded in a paper bag, my heart was beating so hard I thought I might faint. The woman who ran the feed store was named Willa Hargrave. She was 68, broad-shouldered with dark eyes and a long gray braid down her back. She had been running the store since her husband died 10 years ago. I had heard about her from Grace. I set the bag on the counter. I pulled out the first quilt, a small log cabin pattern in shades of green and rust. Willa took one look at it and went very still. "Who made this?" she said. I did. "Who taught you Grace Brennan?" "Who taught her?" I swallowed. "My mother." Willa Hargrave looked up at me. She set the quilt down on the counter very gently, as if it were something living. "What was your mother's name, Eleanor?" "Eleanor Strand." She closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, they were wet. "Mira," she said, "your mother delivered my second baby in this very feed store in 1979. When the roads were blocked by a blizzard and the doctor couldn't get through. She wrapped my son in her own coat. He's a man now, 45 years old. He's a teacher in Madison. He has 3 children of his own. They are all alive because your mother was here that night." She came around the counter. She took both my hands in hers. Her hands were calloused and warm. "Where have you been hiding?" I did not know how to answer. So I told her the only true thing. In someone else's life. Willa bought all 3 quilts that afternoon. She paid me $300 in cash from the store register. She asked me to bring more. By the end of May, I was leaving 6 or 7 quilts at the feed store every 2 weeks, and Willa was selling every single one. The money was not much by Milwaukee standards. By Willow Creek standards, it was everything. Every dollar I earned was a dollar that had come from my own hands, my own eyes, my own slow, patient becoming. I bought good thread. I bought paint. I bought a warm wool sweater in a deep forest green. I bought a small hand mirror, and I hung it on the cabin wall. And for the first time in decades, when I looked at my own face, I did not flinch. I saw a woman with a scar on her arm, and strong hands and steady eyes. I saw an artist. I saw my mother's daughter. I saw finally myself. And then the women began to arrive. They came one by one, finding me through word of mouth, through whispers passed between friends in the grocery store aisles of Birchwood Falls, through quilts purchased at Willa's feed store that carried my mother's stitching in their corners, and something else, something the women who bought them could not name but recognized anyway. The first was Helen, 73 years old. Her husband had died the previous spring. Her son and daughter-in-law had decided without consulting her that she needed to move into an assisted living facility in Madison. The paperwork was already being drawn up. She bought one of my quilts on a whim during a last solo drive through the Northwoods, and something in the small folded square of fabric, the careful stitching, the patience of its making, had told her that the woman who made it might understand. She drove up the dirt road in a dusty hatchback. She got out of her car, holding the quilt against her chest. She looked at me on the porch and she said, "I'm sorry for coming. I didn't know where else to go." I made tea. We sat at my table. She told me everything. Her husband's long illness, the way her son had taken over after the funeral, the way he and his wife had sat her down at her own kitchen table and told her she was no longer capable of living alone, the way they had used the words "for your own good." I poured her tea, and then I told her the only true thing I had learned. You start small. One thing one morning. You take whatever you have left, even if it feels like nothing, and you make one small thing with it. Not for them, for you. Helen stayed for 3 hours that first day. She came back the next week and the week after that. Then came Sarah. Sarah O'Donnell, 66, recently divorced after 40 years, whose children had told her to be an adult about it. Then Henrietta Kowalski, 79, a widow whose late husband had left her the house and whose stepchildren were trying to take it back. Then Yolanda Reeves, 61, who had just been pushed out of the job she had held for 26 years and told by the human resources director that she should consider retirement. Then Willa herself, who drove out one September afternoon and sat at my kitchen table and cried about a husband who had been unkind to her for 40 years before he died, and how she had never been able to say it out loud until now. I did not know how they found me. I did not advertise. I did not invite them. They came the way water finds low ground, quietly, inevitably, one at a time. And I did what my mother's letter had done for me. I opened the door. I poured the tea. I told them the truth about what I had lived. And then I took them up the ladder to the loft, and I put a needle and a piece of fabric in their hands, and I said, "Try." They tried. By late September, the cabin had become something I had never planned and never imagined. On Saturday afternoons, 5 or 6 women gathered in the loft, sewing and talking. Some weeks we worked in silence for hours. Some weeks we laughed so loudly the loons lifted off the water. Helen had finished her first quilt. Henrietta had discovered she was good, really good at choosing colors. Sarah had become my best student with a talent for tiny, precise stitches I could not match. We started calling ourselves the Willow Creek Quilters. Willa began selling our quilts at the feed store. The money we made, we split. We used some of it for fabric. The rest each woman kept for herself. We did not talk about what we were doing. We did not name it. But we all knew. We were stitching ourselves back together. We were taking the scraps of what had been cut away from us, from our marriages, from our children, from our jobs, from our bodies, from our years, and we were making something warm out of them, something that was ours. He came on a Saturday afternoon in late June. I was kneeling in the garden behind the cabin, thinning the radishes I had planted in May, when I heard the sound. At first I didn't recognize it. 8 months of silence had changed my ears. The wind in the pines, the loons on the water, the creak of the cabin settling. These were the sounds I knew now. But this was something else. The low growl of an engine laboring up the dirt path that led to Willow Creek. I sat back on my heels in the soil and I went very still. No one came up that path. Not Samuel, not Grace, not Willa. The mail came to a rented box in town. The sound of an engine here meant one thing. Someone had come looking for me. I stood slowly. I brushed the dirt from my hands. I walked around the side of the cabin just as the car emerged through the pines. A black Lexus. Spotless. Impossibly out of place on that rough road. And behind the wheel, with his jaw set, the way he always said it when he was preparing to be reasonable with someone he considered unreasonable, was Warren. But there was someone else in the passenger seat. A man in a suit, younger, carrying a leather briefcase. Warren parked beside my old Buick. Both men got out. They stood there in the dappled light, and Warren stared at me. I knew what he was seeing. I could feel it the way you feel weather coming. He was seeing a woman in a faded canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, revealing the long, pale scar on her left forearm. He was seeing hands stained with dirt. He was seeing silver hair pulled back with a piece of twine. He was seeing sun on her face and calluses on her palms, and a body that had grown lean and capable in ways he had never seen it before. He was seeing the woman I had never been allowed to become while I was married to him, and he did not know what to do with her. "Mira," he said. His voice was careful. "My God, look at you." I said nothing. I waited. He walked toward me slowly, the way a man walks toward an animal he is not sure is tame. The lawyer hung back by the car. Warren stopped about 10 feet away. "You did this," he said. It was not a question. It was almost an accusation. "I did," I said. "Alone, alone." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He looked older than I remembered. Grayer, heavier, and somehow smaller than the man I had stood beside for 48 years. "Mira," he said, "I need to talk to you. This is my attorney, Mr. Grayson. He's here because what we need to discuss is well complicated. May we come inside?" I looked at him. I looked at the lawyer with his briefcase. I looked at the cabin behind me. The cabin I had cleaned and warmed and made a home of. The cabin that had no electricity and no plumbing that Warren would consider plumbing. And a green door I had painted myself. "No," I said. "We can talk on the porch." Warren's mouth tightened, but he nodded. We sat on the porch, me on the steps, Warren on the chair I had repaired, the lawyer standing awkwardly with his briefcase on his knee. Warren did not waste time. "Mira, my situation has changed. The real estate company has had some reverses. Natasha and I are no longer together. She left 2 months ago when she realized what the situation was." I watched him carefully. There was something in his eyes I had never seen before. Not quite desperation, but close. Fear, maybe. The look of a man who had run out of other options. "I've been doing some legal review of our marital assets," he continued, "and I have learned that your mother left you a sum of money in a Wisconsin bank account. A considerable sum. I am here to inform you that under Wisconsin law, any inheritance received during the course of our marriage is potentially subject to division as marital property." He paused. He let it land. "Mr. Grayson has prepared a document for your signature. We are prepared to settle this amicably. $40,000 paid to my real estate holdings. In exchange, we will not pursue the matter further in court." I sat on the porch step. I looked at my husband of 48 years. I looked at the lawyer. I looked at the dust their car had kicked up, still hanging in the late June sun. "And if I don't sign," I said. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "litigation in matters of this kind can be extended. 2 years, perhaps 3. The legal fees alone, I am sorry to tell you, would likely exceed the disputed sum. It is in everyone's interest to resolve this today." Warren leaned forward. His voice softened in the way it used to soften when he wanted something from me and believed that gentleness would work better than force. "Mira, I am not the enemy here. I am giving you a chance to keep something. You don't want a court fight at your age. Just sign." I looked at him for a long time. I looked at the man who had told me at 22 that I should give up my degree. The man who had controlled our bank accounts for 48 years. The man who had made me ask permission to buy groceries. The man who had slid divorce papers across our kitchen table. Like I was a failed business venture he needed to liquidate. The man who had taken my house, my children's loyalty, my voice, my years. And now he had come here, to the one place my mother had managed to hide from him, to take the one thing she had managed to save for me. I stood up. "I need you to wait here for one moment," I said. I went into the cabin. I climbed the ladder, slowly, my hip aching as it always did at the end of a long day. I went to the wooden chest under the workbench. I picked up the stack of letters, all 207 of them. I carried them down the ladder, holding them against my chest with both arms. I came back out onto the porch. I set the letters on the small table between us. Some of them spilled across the surface. Warren looked at them, frowning. "What is this?" "My mother wrote me letters," I said, "from 1962 until the year she died. Every month, sometimes more often. She never sent them because you would have read them, and what she had to say in them was true. She kept them here so that one day when you finally did what she always knew you would do, I would find them." I picked one up at random. The envelope was dated October 1989. "This one," I said, "is from the year your father died and you inherited his firm. You came home that fall and you told me I needed to start dressing better because the partners' wives were judging me." Do you remember Warren's face had gone still? My mother heard about it. I don't know how. Probably from her own mother in Duluth. She wrote me a letter. I unfolded it. The paper was thin, fragile. "Mira, the man who shames you in public is the same man who will leave you in private. Mark this letter. Save this letter. One day you will need to remember that I knew." I refolded it. I set it on the table. I picked up another. November 3rd, 1991. This one is from 6 months before she died. I unfolded it. "He will leave you. Maybe not soon, maybe not for many years, but he will leave you. Because men like him always leave eventually. They take everything they can take and then they leave. I am writing this so that when it happens you will know that I knew and that I prepared." I refolded it. I set it down. "There are 207 of them, Warren. Every one of them is about you. Every one of them is about what you were doing to me, and what you would do to me, and what kind of man you really were. My mother spent 30 years writing the truth she could not speak. She left me a savings account. She left me a cabin. She left me her quilts and her paintings and her healing books. But more than anything else, she left me these." I looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in my adult life. A tired man in expensive shoes, standing at the edge of a life he had never been invited into, trying to pull me back to a life I had already buried. "You will not get a single dollar of my mother's money," I said. "Not 1 cent. You have already taken everything I had. The house, my years, my silence. You took my children's love for me because you turned them into people who side with whoever has more power. You took my voice. You took my hands and made them fold napkins for 48 years instead of make things. You took everything, and what you didn't know what you never could have known. is that my mother was watching, and she was preparing, and she made absolutely certain you would never touch what she gave me. I picked up the lawyer's settlement document. I tore it in half. I let the pieces fall on the porch. "Tell my husband's attorney," I said, looking at Warren and not at the lawyer, that he should look up Wisconsin Statute 766.31 on inheritance and individual property. He should look up the case law on documented donor intent. He should look up how a 30-year paper trail of bank deposits in a single name made by a woman in a separate state through her own labor holds up in court. He should look up the fact that I have an attorney now. Her name is Faye Whitmore. She is in Madison. She specializes in protecting older women from exactly this kind of theft. Mr. Grayson, I would suggest you and my husband leave." The lawyer was already reaching for his briefcase, but before Warren stood up, he did something I had not expected. He looked at me, really looked at me the same way I had just looked at him, and his eyes filled, and his mouth worked for a moment, and he said very quietly, "I never knew you could do this. Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him for a long moment. The man I had loved at 22, the father of my children, the stranger who had shared my bed for 48 years, Warren. I said I didn't know either. You never asked the questions that would have let me find out. He stood up. He walked to his car. He did not look back. The Lexus turned in the dirt drive and disappeared back down the road through the pines. I sat back down on the porch step. I let out a long, slow breath. Somewhere behind me, across the lake, a loon called. I smiled. Grace arrived the next morning. She brought a casserole and a hug that lasted a full minute. She had heard from Samuel, who had heard from Willa, who had somehow heard from someone in town. News travels in the Northwoods the way wind travels across the lake. Fast and from every direction at once. "He won't come back," Grace said when we were sitting at my small table with coffee. Samuel and I asked around. Your husband's lawyer drove straight to Birchwood Falls after leaving here. Made some calls. They were on the highway south by sundown. Could he still file in court? He could. But honey, your Faye is already on it. She drove up from Madison this morning. She wanted me to tell you. I sat with my hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug. I looked at Grace across the table. This woman my mother had taught to quilt 40 years ago. This woman whose life my mother had saved. This woman who had walked into my cabin in December with a quilting frame and a casserole and had refused to let me be alone. Grace, I said, how did you know to come that first day in December before I even knew you existed? She smiled. Samuel told me, she said. But your mother told me first. 1991, the summer before she died. We were sitting on her dock. She said, Grace, one day my Mirabelle is gonna come up here. I don't know when. It might be 20 years from now. But when she comes, she will be broken. Promise me you will go to her. Promise me you will teach her what I taught you. I promised her. I waited 33 years to keep that promise, Mira. I would have waited 30 more. I had no words. I reached across the table and took her hand. Adelaide came in late September. I had not heard from her in 9 months, not since the phone call the morning after Warren left. I was in the garden harvesting the last of the tomatoes my mother had left seeds for when I heard a car on the road. I expected one of the women. Instead, it was a small white sedan I did not recognize, and out of it stepped my daughter. Cecilia had cut her hair. It was shorter than I had ever seen it. She was thinner. She had a small overnight bag in her hand. She stood by her car in the driveway looking at the cabin, looking at me, looking at the garden and the painted door and the small wooden sign I had hung above the porch that read Willow Creek in letters I had burned into the wood with a heated piece of wire. She did not move. I set down my basket of tomatoes. I walked over to her. I stopped a few feet away the way Warren had stopped from me 3 months before. She started to cry before she could speak. Big, ugly, breaking sobs. The kind I had never seen from my daughter. The kind I had not known she was capable of. "Mom," she said, "I left him. I left Jeffrey 3 weeks ago." I did not say anything yet. "Mom, I have been treating you the way Dad did. I see that now. I see it because if you were a victim, that meant I might be one too. And I couldn't. I couldn't let myself. And so I made you wrong. And I made you small. And I made you." I stepped forward and I took my daughter in my arms. She cried into my shoulder for a long time. I did not say it's all right because it wasn't. I did not say I forgive you because that wasn't a sentence to be said in a driveway. I just held her the way my mother had held me when I came up here as a small girl in 1956, before the silence began. When she was done crying, I took her hand. I led her to the cabin. I took her up the ladder. I showed her the loft. I showed her my quilts and my mother's quilts and the bench where Eleanor had worked. I showed her the letters. I showed her the bank book. I showed her the painting of me as a child. Cecilia sat on the floor of the loft, and she looked at the painting for a long time. "Mom," she said, "that's me. That's what I look like in my baby pictures. It's me at 7. Your grandmother painted it from memory. I thought she didn't even like you. Dad always said your mother was difficult. Your mother was cold. Your mother is the reason your mother is the way she is. I know. He lied. He lied." Cecilia slept on the floor of the loft that night on a quilt I had made out of pieces of her childhood dresses. I had not known I was making it for her, but I had been the whole time. She stayed 3 days. She helped me harvest the garden. She met Grace and Samuel and Willa and Helen and Sarah. She sat in my kitchen and listened while Sarah told the story of the morning she finally left her husband. She drove back to Chicago with 3 jars of elderberry jam from Grace's pantry and a small lap quilt I had made the previous winter and never sold. We did not solve everything between us. We did not need to. We had begun. In early October, I sat at my small table and I wrote a letter to my son. Dear Gideon, I am writing from the cabin Grandma Eleanor left me in northern Wisconsin. The cabin she came to every summer for 30 years while I never knew. The cabin where she was herself. I have learned to quilt. I have learned to paint. I have a community of women who found me without being called. Your sister came and stayed. We are healing. I found 207 letters Grandma wrote to me but never sent. One from June 1978, when I was pregnant with you. The baby will be yours, Mira. He cannot take that. She was right. You were mine. You are mine. Even when you chose your father's side because he had more power. Even when you told me you knew for over a year and said nothing. I am writing to say the door is open when you are ready. I don't know if you ever will be. I have made my peace with that. Your sister coming home is its own miracle. I will not ask for two. But if you ever want to know who your grandmother really was or who I am becoming, Willow Creek will be here. Love, Mom. I mailed it on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. I drove into Birchwood Falls and stood at the post office counter and handed it to the clerk and watched her stamp it and drop it into the outgoing mail bin. Gideon did not reply. Not that week. Not that month. Not by the time the leaves turned and fell, and the cold began to creep back in. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I had made my peace with it. And most days I believed that. But some days I stood at the window and watched the road and wondered if a car would come. If my son would decide that knowing me was worth the discomfort of admitting he had been wrong. Those days were hard. But they were not the only days. And that I was learning was enough. October 29th arrived. 1 year to the day since I had turned onto that narrow dirt path with $847 in 2 suitcases and nowhere on earth to go. The women came in the afternoon. Grace and Samuel, Willa, Helen, Sarah, Henrietta, Yolanda. 3 more I had met over the summer. They brought casseroles and apple pie and coffee from Grace's old percolator. They brought a quilt they had made for me in secret, all of them working on different blocks through September, piecing it together when I wasn't looking. It was a wedding ring pattern in shades of blue and green and gold. The colors of Silver Lake through the seasons. Each woman had signed her block with her initials embroidered in the corner. We ate on the porch because the cabin was too small for all of us. We laughed. We told stories. Samuel, the only man, sat quietly in the corner and smiled and said very little the way he always did when the women gathered. But when Helen asked him to pass the pie, he said, I made a quilt last week for my late wife, Rose. Put it on her grave. Your mother would have liked that, Mira. She always said the dead deserve beauty, too. They left as the sun was setting. One by one, the cars pulled away down the dirt road. Grace and Samuel were the last to go. You did good. Honey, Grace said, hugging me on the porch. Your mama would be proud. When they were gone, I walked down to the dock alone. The air was cold and sharp and smelled of pine and coming snow. The lake was still and dark, reflecting the last light of the day. The birches along the shore were bare now, their white bark glowing in the dusk like bones. I sat on the end of the dock with a notebook in my lap, the same notebook I had started writing in back in June. And I wrote, "Today I am 76 years old. I live alone in my mother's cabin at the edge of Silver Lake. I have strong hands. I have a scar on my arm. I have a loft full of quilts and paintings and a wooden box of 207 letters that taught me I was always loved. I have a community of women who found me without being called. I have a daughter who is finding her way back. I have a son I am still hoping for. And I have, for the first time in my life, a self that I recognize when I look in a mirror. I was not too old. Mama was right. I was only now beginning. I wrote more, filling the page and then another. Words for myself. Words for whoever might find this someday. A granddaughter, maybe, or a stranger. Or another woman who came to Willow Creek because someone whispered the way. If you are reading this, I wrote, I want you to know something. You were never worthless. You were only hidden. You were a cabin in the woods that no one wanted because they could not see what was inside. You were a woman with an artist's hands who was told to fold napkins. You were loved always by the women who came before you, even the ones you never knew were watching. Open the hatch. Climb the ladder. You are not finished. You are only now beginning. You are home. I closed the notebook. I looked out across the water. The birches on the far shore were catching the last light of the day, that particular quality of illumination my mother had called lantern light. The brief moments when something ordinary catches fire and turns to gold. She had named this place for that light. She had spent 30 years coming here to find it. And now I had a year of it. And I would have, God willing, however many years she had been hoping for me, when she put that brass key into my 7-year-old hand and told me I would always have somewhere to go. Across the lake a loon called. The last call of the year, perhaps. The sound went into me and stayed. Behind me I heard a car on the road. Grace, probably. Or Helen, or Sarah coming back because she had forgotten something. We had planned a small gathering, just the women, for this evening. Coffee and pie, and the comfort of each other's company as the year turned and winter came. I closed my notebook. I stood up on the dock. I turned back toward the cabin, and I stopped. The car in the driveway was not one I recognized. A rental, maybe. Washington plates. The door opened, and my son stepped out. Gideon stood beside the car, one hand on the roof, looking at me across the 50 yards of ground between the dock and the cabin. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. His hair was grayer at the temples. He wore a jacket I had never seen. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then he lifted one hand. Not quite a wave, just an acknowledgement. I'm here. I lifted my hand in return. He walked slowly toward me. I walked slowly toward him. We met in the middle in the garden where the tomatoes had been, where the earth was dark and rich and ready for winter. "Mom," he said, his voice cracked on the word. "Gideon," I said, "I got your letter." "I know." "You didn't write back." "I couldn't. Not in writing. I had to." He stopped. He looked at the cabin, at the painted door, at the sign above the porch, at the chimney with smoke rising, at the garden, at me. "I had to see it," he said. "I had to see you, to know if it was real." "It's real." He nodded. His eyes were wet. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, for choosing him, for knowing and not telling you, for being the kind of man who does that." "You're here now," I said. "That's different." "Is it enough? I don't know yet," I said. "But it's a start." He smiled, a sad, small smile. The smile of a man who knows he has a long way to go and is finally willing to walk it. "Can I stay, just for tonight? I have a hotel in town, but I thought, if you'd let me, I could help with whatever you're doing. Chop wood or something. I don't know. I just want to be here." I looked at my son, 46 years old, standing in a garden in northern Wisconsin, asking his mother for permission to help her chop wood. "The women are coming for coffee in an hour," I said. "You can stay if you want, but you have to meet them, all of them, and you have to listen. I can do that. And tomorrow, if you're still here, I'll show you the loft." His eyes widened slightly. The loft where Grandma kept her quilts, where she wrote the letters, where she painted, where she was herself. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "Then come on," I said. "Help me carry the chairs out of the cabin. Grace will be here soon and she'll want to sit in the good one." We walked together toward the cabin, my son and I. Not side by side, not yet, but moving in the same direction. And for now, that was enough. The women came. They met Gideon with the careful politeness of people reserving judgment. Samuel shook his hand and said, "Good you came, son. Better late than never." We sat on the porch as the light failed and the cold came in. We drank coffee. We ate pie. We told stories. And somewhere in the middle of it, I looked around at the circle of faces in the lantern light, and I understood what my mother had known all along. This was the inheritance she had left me. Not just the cabin, not just the money, not just the quilts or the letters or the loft. This, the circle, the women, the slow, patient work of stitching ourselves back together, the knowledge that we did not have to do it alone, the knowledge that somewhere always there had been women watching, women preparing, women leaving keys and letters and bank accounts and hidden rooms for the daughters who would need them. Women lighting lanterns in the dark and saying, "Here, this way. You are not lost. You are not finished. You are only now beginning. Later, after the women had gone and Gideon had driven back to his hotel with a promise to return in the morning, I stood alone on the porch and looked out at the lake. The stars were out. More stars than I had ever seen in Milwaukee. So many that the sky looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. I thought about my mother, about Eleanor, who had lived 2 lives for 51 years, who had kept herself hidden so she would not be taken, who had loved me enough to prepare for a day she would not live to see. I thought about Warren driving south in his black Lexus, returning to a life that had collapsed around him. I felt something for him then. Not quite pity, not quite forgiveness, but a recognition. We had both been living half lives. The difference was I had finally stopped. I thought about Gideon in a hotel room in Birchwood Falls, trying to figure out how to be the man he wanted to be instead of the man his father had made him. I thought about Cecilia in Chicago, building something new from the pieces of what she had left behind. And I thought about myself, 76 years old, alone in a cabin in the woods, hands scarred and strong, heart broken and mending. Not the woman I had been, not yet the woman I would become, but somewhere in between, somewhere in the making. I went inside. I climbed the ladder to the loft one more time. I lit the small lamp. I sat at my mother's workbench and I looked at the quilts hanging from the beams, at the paintings stacked against the wall, at the notebooks filled with her handwriting. And I picked up a needle and a square of fabric and I began to stitch. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The lake whispered against the shore. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. And in a small loft in a cabin called Willow Creek, a woman who had been told she was finished discovered that she was only now beginning. The lantern burned late into the night.